Hello again and very welcome to the chapter about defensive sacrifices. This is a very interesting topic. Sometimes in defensive situations we can give away material in order to help the defensive task. Usually we have to have some kind of motivation, long-term motivation for this, because we're not giving back material as in chapter 13, if you remember, where our opponent would sacrifice in the attack. They would get greater activity. We would give back material in order to stabilize things, bring things back into their place. Here it's different because we're actually giving up material, so there must be some kind of compensation for this to work out properly. Usually we're talking about something in the pawn structure. For example, if you remember in the chapter about the blockade, we saw how, I think it was in the French game between Hracek and Hausrat, that black played, if you remember, rook f5 at some point to block the f-pawn. White took the rook with the bishop on d3, took the rook on f5. Black took back with the knight. They were exchanged down, but they had a very nice position because the knight was feeling so well in that closed pawn structure with protected squares. So something like that, it's the kind of scenario that we are looking for when we are sacrificing something in the defense, like a long-term sacrifice. And also it can be a question of sacrificing a pawn. That can also be very useful. We give away a pawn for increased activity or something within the pawn structure that will help us. So we will have a look at these two situations, exchange sacrifices within defensive play, and also giving up a pawn. We will look at that in the second part of this chapter. So let's get started. In our first example, you will see a situation where we are actually suffering quite a lot with white. White is a pawn up. However, their king is in danger. It's easy to see that the king is exposed. If the knight moves, for example, we have a mating pattern on h1. If we look at the relative value of the pieces, which is something that we will come back to quite a lot in this chapter, we can see that black's bishop on e4 is a giant here. This bishop is very, very strong. The bishop on e4, it's helping the attack. And also you can imagine that if black at some point is able to take the pawn on a3, it will also help to escort the pawn, the passed pawn. It's the kind of scenario that the bishop likes very much when there are pawns on both flanks. While white's minor piece, the knight, is not very active right now. And in the same way, you can actually also see that the rooks, black's rook is much more active than white's. You can see that white's rook is suffering a little in the middle. It's not doing too much, while black is playing on the first rank, and it can also, the rook can go to the second rank. So definitely we have to do something drastic here to save this position. In the game, this game, by the way, Thibaut with white and Sanal with black. Thibaut played in the game rook d1, trying to trade off rooks, but black was not interested in that. They played rook c2. As you can see now, they're targeting the pawn on f2. White played queen f1, and after queen takes e3, they had a very difficult game here, white, and black went on to win. So since you know which is the topic involved in this chapter, of course, you have already noticed which would be white's best move. Definitely such a strong bishop on e4, and our rook is not that powerful on d4. This is actually a good transaction for us. Rook takes d4, good business for white. After f takes e4, you can see that now we're exchanged down, but we have one pawn also. We were one pawn up from the beginning, but we are slightly material down. But something with this particular pawn structure helps the defending side. There are also weaknesses on black's king side, as you can see. White should hurry here to play queen g4 to target the pawn on e4, which means that black's queen will be a little more restricted. Let's say black puts the queen on c6. I don't think it makes a big difference. And what white will do here, of course, it's time to bring in the knight. Now we can use the knight for active measures. I think it's best to go from on this side on h3 so that we protect the pawn on f2 on the way, so to speak. What white should not do here, of course, is trade off the queens. We have to keep the queens, and we should try to bring the knight to f4. In that way, we will have counterplay on the king side. It won't be that easy for black to progress. So let's say, for example, black plays here queen g6, trying to trade queens. We will say no. We will continue to keep the queens on the board, something like queen d7. And at this point, we would like to play knight f4 next turn. After that, black will have several squares that they will have to take care of with the queen, among which, of course, we have the f5 square. Let's say black plays something like rook c2, targeting the pawn on f2. First, we should safeguard this pawn. King g1 seems more natural to avoid any black checks on the f3 square with the queen at some point. After queen h5, this is what I looked at, knight f4, they can go rook c1. Now, of course, we have to be careful. We should not step on g2, so we will go to h2 instead. Black will have to go back and take care of the pawn on e4 here, queen e5 perhaps. If they try to attack us, you can just see for the record here that white will give check, and who knows what will happen here next, but at least the pressure is on black now. White could give a perpetual, but they can also try to cook up some kind of attack at this point with the queen and the knight. But at minimum perpetual here with queen e6. So let's say black keeps the queen in the center instead, usually a good place for the queen in the endgame. And you can guess white's next move here, right? Sorry. That's right, we would simply play here the move h5. Very good move. We are like cementing the knight on f4. It can now not be expelled in any way from there. The g5 will never be possible due to en passant. And at the same time, you can see that we are fixing a square on g6 that can be used by both the queen and the knight. No, we can try to bring the queen there, for example, something like queen f7, queen g6. It's difficult for black to progress in this position. It's difficult because also they have to keep an eye on other ideas, like white could play perhaps the king to g2 so that the pawn won't fall off with check, and later on try to bring the knight to e6, for example, to attack this pawn on g7 to tie up black's queen. So safe to say, no matter what happens here, white has a lot of counterplay. They are probably able to keep the balance, even if material is slightly negative for them. Please notice the presence of queens. If queens are off, we can basically resign because black will win the game on the queen side. But here we have the queens on the board, so there are always chances for counterplay. So this would have been a good option for white in this game. Just give up the exchange in this sense. Rook takes e4. That was a very useful idea here, practical idea. It's easy to play black, to play white also, not so easy to play black. That would have been a good opportunity for white in the context of defensive sacrifices. All right, let's check our next example. It's with a more crowded board. Again, we're sitting with white pieces. You can see that black again has sacrificed a pawn, but they have a lot of activity. You could see black's development is great. Only the rook is basically missing for black to have all the pieces in play. You can see that the knight has some potential strong squares on d3 and f3. You can see that there is the pawn which would like to advance, and the bishop on g7 would wake up, and there are many other things. One funny plan that black can consider here is something like rook d6 and at some point take on d5, tactic change, because if later on, let's say the knight is not on d2, then there would be ideas with knight f3. So safe to say, this is a complex situation for white in this game between Cordoba with white pieces and Gutla playing black. So what I think, I looked at many moves here, but one move that we should check, of course, is, let me see here, which was the variation that I wanted to show, the one with the queen sacrifice. Which one was that? Let me see here very quickly. Which was the line? Yeah, with knight f3. This is a natural move. We would try to trade off the knights to bring the pieces into the game. We would like to join with the bishop also. But here black would sack the queen, as I was already telling you exactly. We would play here queen takes d5. That's very pretty. It shows something about black's potential here. If c takes d5, knight takes f3, as you can see, white would have big problems here. It's not just that we will take the rook next turn after king f1. What do you think black would play at this point? Aha, there is a bigger, you could say, reward here. Bishop h3 after king e2, we have knight e4. So this shows the potential of black's position. You could say knight f3 impossible due to this, or it's dangerous at least. You will have to play after knight f3, queen takes d5, knight takes e5. But that was perhaps not the idea that white had here, because now after queen e6 we're pinning the knight, and this means that with bishop h3 next, their king will always be under some pressure here in this position. So that's not really working in the game. I can see now they played rook e3. I think this move is designed to cover the d3 square basically. Black played rook b6, a funny way to use the rook, some kind of rook lift along the third rank, but very powerful in this case. Queen c2 was the course of the game, and here black played a clever move, knight c6. I think it's logical because white just took away some of the knight's supposed destinies on d3 and f3, so now the knight is rerouted and it's basically going to b4, which would like to trade off white's defending bishop, the dragon bishop, so to speak. So white played a3, and now you can guess what black played. Exactly, now we can settle on d4 instead. So a nice way of improving the knight. Queen d3, bishop f5, white played knight e4, hoping to trade pieces, but black played knight b3 here. Very annoying position for white. Black has a lot of pressure, and they later on went on to win here in this game. You can see some tactical issues with knight c5, and even this pawn is a little weak, as you can see, something with knight takes and rook takes b2. So not very pleasant to play this with the white pieces, and there was a much better solution. So if this is complex, we should compare it with what white omitted in the game. It was actually a good occasion for doing exactly the same thing as in the previous game. Again, sack the exchange, sack a rook for a knight, or trade a rook for a knight, whatever you would prefer to call it. Rook takes e5 in this given situation, when the knight was so strong, this is actually very useful. They take back, bishop takes e5, and we hurry to bring the knight into the game. I think this is the best destiny for the knight, because we enable bishop g5 next turn. Also, we have, of course, bishop h6 as a second idea here. And you can see that already by now, it's a different story. No? White's pieces are starting to get into good places, and the annoying knight is gone. So let's have a look at some possibilities here. Rook b6, now we can put the queen on a3. It's protecting the pawn, and it's also having a look at the a5 pawn. So maybe black should try to trade off this bishop on d5. They could play something like bishop e6, and we could continue with our plan, bring out the pieces. Bishop g5 or bishop h6. I will stick to bishop h6 because it also creates some kind of mating scenario. Not that we're going to mate black, but at least, rook e8. They will have to think about the back rank, right? We add some extra spice to our position. Obviously, if they play something like bishop g7, we could trade, and we can then use the long diagonal to harass them a little. No, so that would be unpleasant. And also, you can see that, after bishop takes, king takes. I don't know if we would give the check at once. I think we would actually, right? And you can see there are some pitfalls for black here, something with knight c5 coming up also, if they play f6, for example. So looks interesting for white, this situation. So rook e8, rook d1 would be a good move here, bring all the pieces to the battle. Now we have the threat of bishop takes. If they take on d5, I think we could take with the pawn, setting up a passed pawn. Let's say they play something like rook b6. At this point, we lose the pawn on b2, but I think we can actually go for an attack here. Queen f3 is very clever, because we keep on defending the rook, and we get ready again to take on e6. So black will have to take on d5 probably. We can take with the pawn so that we keep the idea of a passed pawn on the d file. Black should be very careful now. You can see that d6, d7 is coming. Maybe they will push away the knight by f5, and where would you put that knight? Aha, that seems to make perfect sense. Knight c5, so that it can come to e6. I think we don't really need to analyze or to calculate that many variations. We can also see something here. We can generalize. We can notice that white's pieces are very active. They are indeed exchanged down. They have one pawn, but it's a slight material disadvantage. But just like in the previous example, they have a lot of activity, and something in the structure also helps them, like the e6 square in this case, and the passed pawn. So that's what I think would have been the best choice. Now you will say, but if this is so simple, why didn't the grandmaster just take on e5? Well, I don't think it's simple for anyone. This topic, giving away material, is one of the things that chess players usually struggle with, especially when you end up material down, like in this case, as in this whole chapter. So it's definitely an area where we can learn to understand something about the relative value of the pieces. If you ask me, this knight on e5, it's probably not worth 3 points. It's worth a little more, maybe you could say 4 points. And who knows, the rook on e1, it's not a bad rook, of course, but maybe it's actually good business to do this. The piece which is really having a high value here for white, you got it, the bishop on d5. This is a key piece for white. That piece must not leave the board. At least if it would have to be for the other bishop, I would say. Else it should stay on the board. It's a very important piece. So in a way, you can say also that by playing rook takes e5, it's like white secures their bishop, because the piece which could challenge this bishop is the knight, right? Something like knight here or knight there, or you name it. So in that sense, also we are like helping to keep our more active pieces on the board. By taking on e5 here, sacrificing. All right, long discussion, but I hopefully made myself clear. Let's continue. Let's take another example. By now, all the best moves are obvious because you know in which chapter we are, but in any case, let's see if we can look at things in their perspective. We're playing with the white pieces here. It's Pichot versus Julio Granda. You can see that it's a Caro-Kann. We're having the white pieces, I was saying, right? And there is an imminent threat, of course, threat of knight g3 mate here after h takes. The king is, very exposed. So we have to do something about that. We can't really play bishop g4. This would be a typical idea. We saw that in chapter 6, I think it was, about obstruction, but here it would backfire because black can actually set up a mating combination here. Knight g3 check anyway, pawn takes, bishop h3. What would black play? Aha, you got it, rook takes h3. Some kind of typical combination, g takes h3, bishop e4. This would be very bad for white because if they try to give back material, black will just say no. They'll go for an attack instead. Very nice move, queen f2. So yeah, this would be a nightmare. Something to be avoided, but here you can already see the strength of this knight. This knight is very powerful, the knight on f5. It wants to go to g3, but sometimes it can also go to e3, for example. So what Pichot did here, he also noticed that on the other side of the board, on the queen side, he's actually having like an advantage because he has managed to push a6. This is always useful. He has fixed the pawns in a favorable way. And if he managed to get to an endgame, he will have the bishop pair, which is also important. So yeah, adding different things together, you can guess the right move here exactly. Rook takes f5. In this way, we avoid the threat of knight g3, and after bishop takes f5, we can try to take the game into an endgame. It was possible to play something like h3 here also, but I think it's much nicer what he played in the game. Queen g1. Very pretty because white would like to get into the endgame. And in this way also you can see that black's supposed attack is basically over here in this case. It's important to play this move, by the way, queen g1, because black had h3 coming up also. We can't play something like, if you play rook a5, it's a little too optimistic now. They would go h3, and if we take the pawn, the king will just run away. This will hang over us, this move, bishop e4. So you could play h3 first, but even nicer, queen g1, because if they trade queens, well, then h3 is not that important anymore because the king won't be in danger anymore. And that's what happened in the game. They took on g1, and white, after taking back, they're already focusing here on the endgame. As you can see, the pawn is hanging. Black had some other options here. Maybe they should have tried to find something more dynamic. I was looking at this move d4. It was not completely approved by the computer, I think, but it's what we call revolution, right? We try to change the nature of the battle when we feel that we are worse. Long term, we will talk about that in chapter 31, I think. After c takes d4, we could put the queen on d5 and then try to block everything here with bishop e4. This would have been an interesting idea for black, perhaps, to try to keep the balance by giving up a pawn. And material, by the way, would be roughly equal, you could say, in this case. But okay, in the game, they took on g1, white takes back, and black now tries to set up some counterplay. Instead of protecting this pawn, if they play rook b8, definitely we will play bishop e3, you're completely right, targeting the pawn on a7. So instead of that, black played here b4. I think this is the right spirit, trying to open up the game for the rooks. But Pichot simply carried on with his plan, bishop e3, no reason to complicate things here. If he takes on b4, I think black could play even d4 and try to run with this pawn. This would make white's task a little more difficult. So bishop e3 is a great move here, simply carrying on with the queenside attack. After pawn takes, you can see that the bishop is ready to protect the pawn if necessary. What white would like to do now is to bring in the rook also. So after black castled, we have to find a way to get to the b file, and for that reason here, with b1 occupied, white played instead rook a4. Very clever. They're also touching the pawn on h4, by the way, but the main idea here is to play rook b4 and rook b7. Black can't really stop this in a very convincing way, I think. They are also thinking about this pawn, of course, so they played in the game rook fc8 with a counter-attack so that white protects this pawn, and now black, they don't have to think about this threat anymore, something like that. But after, bishop d4, rook c7, white simply played rook b4, and they were ready to play rook b7 at some point. Yeah, you can see the ideas here, like take, and put the bishop on a6 and take on a7, things like that. That's what happened in the game. So very nice, I would say, metamorphosis in this example. Black was playing for an attack, but white said, all right, let's just eliminate that strong knight and let's go for the endgame. So they played here the very nice move, rook takes f5, and after that they were ready to fight on the queen side with queen g1 and bishop e3 and so on. I think this was a very instructive example. We should think about the relative value of the pieces. That knight was really powerful, and it's worth it to get rid of it. Okay, in our next example, we will have a look at a different structure, like a King's Indian structure, or you would say Benoni structure. White has just played here knight ce4. It's easy to understand what White has in mind here in this game between Vtácnik with White and Martyrosyan playing black. White would like to trade off black's best minor piece. Aha, you got it. Definitely in many King's Indian, this is a key piece, the bishop on g7. So White tries to trade it off and later on play for an attack. After all, you can see that White has actually, they're sitting with a worse pawn structure. They played f4 at some point. They opened the f file. They ended up with weaknesses on e3, and also the e5 square is weak and the e4 square, but they have a lot of compensation. They would like to play rook f1, and if black plays f5, this pawn will be weak. Maybe they can play something like rook g3, attacking and so on. So basically that's what White is after here, playing for an attack against black's king. You can see that black has several pieces which are not very active right now. So at this point, Martyrosyan, he took a very nice decision, which I would like to offer you to find also. So if you really want to keep that bishop on the board, I'm talking about this bishop on g7, if you don't want to trade off that bishop, what would you play? Is there any way of like saving that bishop? That's right, that's completely right. We can save it, we can keep it on this diagonal, but only in one good way. Aha, we give away the exchange. That's what he played in the game. Martyrosyan, rook e5, very pretty move. As you can see, if now White takes, we take back, and White's attack is not that dangerous anymore. After bishop takes e5, rook af1, we can safely play here f5. Yeah, there is no rook g3, for example. White will have to go back with a knight, and we can start bringing in the pieces. That bishop is really giant. It's also directed at White's king, so who knows, maybe we can use it later in some kind of attacking scenario also. You can imagine something like queen h4, knight g5, queen g3, things like that. So Vtácnik, he didn't want to accept this. He played in the game instead rook af1. In any case, if you like, we can also check, of course, very briefly what happens if black just ignores this idea and they play some natural move. So I think one of the lines that I investigated here was what happens if we trade and we play, yeah, which was the line? Like that, bishop takes, queen takes, and now if we play something like rook e5, was that the idea? Rook e5 trying to block the white queen. White would then play rook a f1, and after f5, what do you think White would play here? Would they move the knight, or is there something more stronger here? Exactly, we're talking now, again, attacking logics, no? If there are more attackers than defenders, that usually means that sacrifices can be considered, and this is another example. Rook g3, very clever move. We are giving up a piece here after f takes e4. We have rook takes g6, and as you can see, White's pieces are coming very quickly. The knight will take on e4 because Black's rook is always unable to move here. Let's say king h8, and after knight takes e4, yeah, it's even illegal to take on e4. You can see this is going to be a very tough situation for black, because even knight takes d6 and queen takes e5 is coming up next. Complete nightmare. Black is material up, but their pieces are simply too far away from the action. So that's common sense when we're attacking, that we are ready to give away material when we have more pieces in the attack. That's what could happen here if after the move knight e4, if black just takes and tries to defend in like a conventional way. But the right move here, as we already know, rook e5, very pretty move. Let's see what happened in the game. Rook af1, black played f5. Now the moment is right for this. White continues exactly like in the previous variation. They're playing in a dynamic way, playing for an attack. It's still possible to go wrong here if we take on e4. Sorry, White will take on e5 at this point after bishop takes, rook takes g6. You can see that now, finally, White is actually breaking through. They will take on e4 with the queen. This would be extremely dangerous. Let's say bishop g7, queen takes. And yeah, black can hardly not move here in this position. And White has a lot of threats still, like they could maybe take the pawn here, or they could maybe bring in the knight also to the attack. Or maybe there is something even stronger. I don't know, move the queen somewhere and try to play queen f7. Scary to play this with black for sure. So in the game after rook g3, black calmly protected the pawn by playing here queen e8, giving this pawn some further protection. And it's interesting that Vtácnik, a very experienced grandmaster, he actually went all in here. He understood, you could say, the strategical importance of this position. He knew that it was about this, what can you say, like Petrosyan, like positional exchange sacrifice. He knew that he should try to keep up the dynamics and not just cash in. So he played here bishop takes h5. So now the game gets really interesting. After all, you could say this bishop on e2, it was not that active, so we can use it for attacking purposes. G takes h5, and here you can see White would like to bring more pieces to the attack. They played knight f3, very, very complex game. You can see that rook takes e4 would now fail to rook takes g7, so Black played in the game f takes e4 instead. And White continued here simply with knight takes e5. After d takes e5, queen takes e5, the game already got very complex, very messy. This position material is about equal, but you can see White is very active, and also there is the concrete threat of, I guess, bishop takes e5. And here, Martirosyan found a very nice move on the topic of obstruction. He could have played, I think, knight d6. It was possible to play like this, but the endgame which occurs here after queen takes e5, yeah, now we must take with the queens. It was being attacked. Queen takes, bishop takes, knight e8. Yeah, that's one of those crazy endgames. Black has 3 pieces for a rook, but White's pawn structure is favorable now. So I'm not sure about this position. Possibly it's okay. I think the engine was saying it was okay for Black, but I think White's task is simpler here. So what he played in the game after queen takes e4, I think is much nicer. Can you find a good move in the spirit of obstruction? Try to block one of the opponent's pieces? Yeah, that's what he did. Bishop g4. What a surprising move. Very pretty. The point is that if you take, you can go h4 and then knight g5, right? You played something like that, the next turn you have knight g5, and then you actually end up a piece up. So that will be bad for White. Very clever move, but okay. Vtatsnik is also in the battle. He understands this perfectly. Dynamics is everything here. He played d6, good move, freeing the square on d5 for the queen on any occasion. Black took on d6, now queen d5 check. I think, yeah, we have to do something about this knight, but we can't really because the bishop is also hanging. Yeah, a crazy position. King h8 was played in the game, and here I think White took on d6, on which Black could have played rook d8, bringing the rook to d7, something like that, and Black was better. But what White should play instead was to play h takes d4, I think. And now we don't have the trick with it's not a fork anymore because the queen has left, but we could play something like rook d8 instead, which means that we build new threats here. The rook is now in the battle and we have knight f5 coming up. It will still be a highly unclear position, but safe to say Black avoided a big attack from White. This was a very clever positional sacrifice, you could say, exchange sacrifice, rook e5. Very nice picture. I really like this move. And it tells us something about the relative value of the pieces. That bishop is simply too strong. It's too strong to trade it, this bishop. We should keep it. And maybe if you remember, we had an example in the chapter about, yeah, what chapter was that? I don't really remember anymore. But it was this game, Novoa versus Asensio, where Black played bishop h6 and they took the rook on f4. If you, yeah, in the prophylaxis chapter, exactly. They took on f4, they lost in a similar pawn structure, they lost that bishop. So it's basically the same thing, you could say, but in a different way. That time it was Black taking the exchange. This time it's Black giving up the exchange. But for the same reason, it's about that very strong bishop on g7. So it's definitely worth it to play rook e5 here to keep the strong bishop on the board. All right, let's see another example of a more positional nature, you could say, less attacking content. In this game with white pieces Bologan and playing Black Sutovsky, you can see that it's Grunfeld battle. Black has very nice pair of bishops. White's pawns on c3 and d5 are a little weak. You can expect that if White just plays something natural like moving the rook, Black will play rook c8, targeting the pawn on c3, and at the same time there is also bishop c4 coming up, and the pawn on d5 would also fall. So this would not be so pleasant for White. They would have a long-term inferiority in this position. So what do you think Bologan played? Is there some other solution here? Perhaps giving up material in the spirit of our chapter? Exactly, that's what he played here. Very beautiful move, c4, We are ready to give up the exchange, but evidently the bishop that we would like to include in this operation is the bishop on g7. Again, we're talking about the fianchetto bishop. That's the bishop that we want to trade. We want to leave them with the other bishop, which is not so powerful here. And also when they take, obviously, they will have some weaknesses on the dark squares, right? Because that bishop has gone. So very nice move here, c4. White gets ready to play rook c1. So if black wants to take the exchange, they will have to do it now, else there will be a pawn down. But if they play something like rook c8, let's say we play rook ac1, and we could always play bishop d4 at some point. Yeah, this does not make sense for black. So in the game after c4, Sutovsky took on a1, rook takes a1, rook ac8. We have to safeguard that pawn. And yeah, white played here knight d2. I think this is a good move because in this way we avoid tension on the c-file, and also we might be ready to at some point hopefully play knight e4. That's our dream, to put a knight on e4 to start targeting all these squares. Black played at this point rook e5. It was interesting to ask the computer about this position. Very often such position, in my experience, they will be equal, objectively speaking, but they will be easier for the side which sacrificed. So the way for black to keep the balance here, it seems, was to play queen c7, and after rook c1 they should play bishop e7. This is pure tactics. It's interesting to notice that the computer wants pure tactics here. It doesn't want white to build up their advantage. So now you have the threat of bishop takes d5, and if white moves away the rook, the bishop will come back. As simple as that. If we try something else here, knight f1, so that the bishop is protecting the rook, the computer said that we can take anyway on d5. Interesting. Bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes, rook takes, bishop takes and rook takes with rook e1 next. So once you see this, it might appear obvious that this gives black some chances, but it's definitely not a routine decision, or even to find a way up to this point is not so easy in the game. So that's why I'm saying this has a practical merit also, the sacrifice that Bologan launched in the game. He knows that there might be some defense for black, some way of equalizing or keeping the balance, but it won't be that easy to find. Let's have a look at the game. They played here rook e5. White played h3. Makes sense to avoid any back rank issues. After all, we only have one rook surveilling the first rank, and they have two rooks to attack with, so that makes perfect sense. b5, now we understand the previous move. Sutovsky wants to undermine the pawn on d5, but now white introduces some tactics here. Queen a3, very clever move. The bishop will have to move away. Bishop b7, and queen takes a7. So if black could somehow eliminate this pawn on d5, they would probably be okay, but Bologan won't let that happen. After b takes c4, he played here rook b1 quickly, creating new threats. Black had to play here rook e7. Had they played instead rook c7, I think there was this nice tactic with d6. Yeah, smart tactic. You can see the point. After queen takes d6, many pieces on this diagonal, and we can actually exploit this by queen b8 check, so that we can take on b7 next turn. Yeah, this would be very tricky tactics for black. I think if bishop c8, perhaps we have knight takes c4. Yeah, interesting. A lot of tactics there, a lot of pieces hanging, but black's pieces are hanging, right? So that's working quite fine. So rook b1, after rook e7, now we will give away the pawn, I was going to say, but that's not true. We don't give it away. When we play d6, if they take this pawn, we will just take on b7, I think. So we're not giving away anything, we're keeping the pawn. It seems that at this point the last chance was to take on e3, rook takes, pawn takes, bishop c6. That's what I have in the notes. Black will have chances for a draw here. But okay, white's a pawn up, so they also have every reason to play for a win. In the game, black played instead queen c6, and now it's too late. White simply plays f3. You can see that this also helps, apart from avoiding mate, it also helps to create a nice square for the knight on e4. Queen takes d6. Now they finally took here, accepting material inferiority. Rook takes, queen takes, rook b8. Black is pinning their hopes on this pawn, but as you can see, it's always good to have the bishop controlling that last square for this pawn. So queen e4 was played in the game, c3, knight b3. The game is not over, of course. There is still a fight going on here, but white is better. You could say they're 1 point up. Also, it's nice for them that black has these long-term weaknesses on the king side. So later on, Bologan, he won this game. So I thought that was a nice example. He was facing some kind of long-term inferiority here if he plays in a routine way, because his pawns are a little weak and black has the bishop pair. But by playing this very, very nice move c4, he was able to keep everything under control, and he's able to get rid of black's strong bishop on on g7. So This makes perfect sense, this move, c4. All right. I thought we could also have a look at another material case. I mean, in the case of another material relation, we're talking exchange sacrifices, but another possible transaction in this sense is when we give away the queen for rook and the minor piece. And that's what we have here in this example. Garyatsky now with white and Guseynov with the black pieces. You can see that white has the initiative. They have, I think, just installed the rook on the 7th rank. You have the threat of queen takes f7, and also the pawn on a7 is hanging. So not so easy for black to find a defense, sorry, but what Guseynov did here was very clever. He noticed that, yeah, by the way, there are these bishops also hanging. We should not forget about that. He noticed that he could actually get to some kind of fortress here. There's something with the pawn structure that helps him to bring about a fortress. So he didn't intend to protect these 2 pawns. There was one way to do it. Yeah, he could have played here rook f8, and after rook takes a7, he had this funny looking move, bishop c8, somehow similar to the not really the lifeline, no, like some kind of counter threat that he's doing here. But you can see what happens here. White will take the queen. Yeah, many pieces hanging, but they will take the queen, and after bishop takes c7, they will probably play this move here, b4. Interesting. Why do they play that? Well, in the first place, because they have to do something about the rook. They don't want to take because black takes back, and now both pawns will be hanging. So it's a smart way of saving both the rook and the pawn by playing here b4. So if black takes, we have b takes a5, and actually white's a pawn up here, and it's not any pawn, no, it's a very strong passed pawn. So white will have some initiative here in this endgame. I think it was Piccola in Chess Informant who analyzed this. Bishop c3, rook d1, counter threat against the bishop, bishop e6, rook takes b5. Finally, white gives back the pawn. Black, by means of rook takes a2, they restore material balance. But as you can see, the nature of the battle here after, let's say, king f1, it's not so pleasant for black. It's not like some endgame where there is a forced draw or anything. They will have to suffer in this endgame. White has an outside passed pawn, and it's protected by the bishop. So this would not be an easy ride for black to the draw. So if you compare this, it's good to compare different inferiorities. Let's compare this with what happens in the game, and you will make your own conclusion about which position is the more pleasant one. So in the game, as you have guessed by now, Guseynov, he took on c7, queen takes c7, queen takes 7, bishop e2. A minimal material disadvantage. White's queen is very active, but there are other things in this position which favor black. After rook c1, we play here bishop g4. This move is very important because we are not going to put our bishop on a square like that. Maybe in some other middle game situation we could do that, but here what we are interested in is reinforcing our position, rook securing our position. So the bishop should go to g4 so that it can settle on e6. Once it's on e6, the pawn will be defended forever, almost forever. And also we are having a look at white's queenside pawns. If we're able to trade off the queenside pawns, safe to say black won't suffer in that endgame with pawns on one single flank. They will have some kind of fortress with the 2 bishops. So very nice thinking here by Guseynov. Queen b7 was played in the game. White is perhaps trying to bring in the rook, I think, or something like that. Black saved the pawn by means of a5. And after b3, I think also white perhaps was worried about the rook b8, or with the other rook perhaps to take the pawn on b2, so they played b3. And here Guseynov played a4. Yeah, we talked about this already. He would like to trade off the pawns on the queen side. After b takes a4, black simply took back on a4, and now we're getting ready to attack this pawn with all our pieces. Now bishop a6, rook e8, and so on. So that's exactly what happened actually. Rook c2, bishop e6, queen c6. White is creating counter threats, but we can simply defend everything, and now they cannot really save this pawn anymore. Rook d2 was played in the game. Now let's not be too fast here. You can see that the back rank is an issue also, right? We cannot take on a2 because they will take back. We have to take with the rook since the other rook, yeah, I mean that rook is hanging, right? And when we take down, they would play queen check, right? Queen on, yeah, where would it be? Queen on e8, for example. And after bishop f8, they will have bishop c5, if you see what I mean. So we shouldn't do that. Simply give some space for the king, making space for the king, bishop f6, very logical move. And now we are ready to take. So the rest of the game, honestly, is not that interesting. Perhaps they played h3, black took on a2, rook takes. Now it's material balance. White got back the pawn, so now actually white's pawn up. But after black's next move here, pawn move, which pawn move do you think black would play? Of course, h5. They have some kind of fortress, and white tried to win this, but it was completely impossible. I think there are even some fortresses when you have two bishops versus a queen. I think I have it in Mastering Endgame Strategy. I think it was Larsen versus Portis, or Portis versus Larsen, something like that. There was a fortress with the two bishops. Not here probably, because white has some dynamics and so on with g4, but okay, we still have the rook on the board, so we're not really worried here. So nice concept, I must say, by Gusenov. Very nice thinking. You would say fortress thinking, that's something about the endgame, but he did it actually in a middle game position. He went for a fortress, you could basically say here. So yeah, he had the other choice where white ended up with a passed pawn on the queen side, if you remember, but he went for this other much more practical approach. Queen takes, bishop takes e2. Black accepts a minimal material advantage, but once the bishop arrives at e6, we're ready to trade off the pawns on the queen side. We have excellent chances for a draw. So that was very clever, this sacrifice, queen takes c7, and then, if you remember, rerouting the bishop to e6. Okay, it's time for us to move on, and we should talk a little about pawn sacrifices within defensive play. And that's what we have here in our next example, with the white pieces Aravind, and playing black is Pragananda. Some kind of Kolle structure with white, the two bishops, the black pawn bishops pointing at least one of them is pointing at black's king, as you can see. We have to be careful in this kind of situation. Very often there is a sacrifice like bishop takes, knight takes, and queen h5. That should be avoided. There are different ways to play here. Maybe we could play g6, for example, but white could bring in the knight, perhaps something like that, bring the knight to g5. They would still have an interesting attacking position here, many pieces in the attack. What Pragananda noticed was that he could actually give away a pawn and make the defensive task much simpler. How did he do that? Well, he played here at this point the move knight e4. Sorry, so this is a surprising move because he just gives away a pawn like that. Why did he do that? It was actually not forced. He could have perhaps survived in the other position with g6, but here you will see that his task will be much more pleasant. Don't forget that white is sitting with a passive bishop now on b2. If you compare again, we're back on the same track again. If we compare the different minor pieces in white's camp, it's easy to see that from all of them, this is probably the least active, it's the least useful piece that they have. So if we can trade off the other pieces, we can definitely hope for some compensation in terms of relative value of the pieces. So after knight e4, if the picture is not clear, just wait until you see what happened in the game. White took on e4, yeah, queen h5, we can just meet it with h6, and nothing is really going on here. I think as a very, very last resort, we have also f5. If nothing else really works, we could weaken ourselves in that way. But okay, in the game, Aravind, he took on e4. After d takes e4, bishop takes e4, bishop takes, queen takes. You can see white has emerged with an extra pawn, but now Pragananda, he has prepared already some kind of blockading idea. So he starts, you can see that he would like to put the knight on d5, but it's mate in one, so he starts with f5, and after white moves away the queen, he takes on e5. He could also start with knight e5, but I guess he didn't want to allow white to keep the knight, some pressure on the pawn and so on. So he takes on e5, and white takes back with a queen, and now we reach an endgame. The interesting thing was if they took with the pawn instead like that. Yeah, you can guess black's next move here, of course, knight e5. Maybe if you have seen this classical game with the white pieces, Reshevsky and playing black Petrosyan, I think it's Petrosyan's most famous game, where he sacrifices a rook on e6, the exchange, on e6, for white's strong bishop on, I think it was on c4. It's almost the same position, you could say. The same pieces, the same material relation, and the same idea of having a strong knight in the center. So, yeah, sometimes the years pass by, but the same ideas, they come up again, like from the good old years. Not so easy for white to progress in this position. You can see that if black could get like a5, a4 in, for example, it would be fantastic if you could soften up this square also. But white will probably play something like rook c1 to push c4. But what do you think black would play there? Can they play something active here, something that creates even more counterplay? That's right, they could play here the move f4. They have a pawn majority on the queen side, the king side. I think they didn't have that in Petrosyan's game, but anyway, that's what we could play here, and then put the knight on e3. That would give us some counterplay. You can even imagine something like, I don't know, c4, knight e3. If they take on b5, maybe we can play something like queen b7, right? Targeting the pawn on g2. Maybe it's even white who's now starting to think about defensive exchange sacrifices. But don't forget that they have a bad bishop, a really bad bishop on b2. So I think this looks very nice for black. Anyway, in the game, nothing of this happened because white took with the queen instead, which makes life safer for them, of course. You could say that in this way they avoid the dangerous attacking team of queen and knight, for example. So black took back on e5. After f takes e5, you can guess the next move, of course, knight e5. So if white could get c4 in, then it's possible that they are better. But Pragananda won't really let that happen. For example, if rook c1, there is rook c6, and if c4, we could simply take once, and after b takes, what do you think black would play? Of course, that's very obvious. Rook fc8. Now they have to do something about this pawn. Yeah, if they take here, we take back, and we have already equalized material. If they play c5, the bishop is worse than ever, and our knight is just fantastic. You could play something like rook b8, and I think in the long run, what white should, or what black should consider is something like push these pawns also, to get a little closer with the kingside pawns. They have a pawn majority, so they should exploit it. I don't think this is any good for white. They would rather be in danger in this position. So what Puranik did Aravind, what he played in the game here, confusing the strong Indian players, he played a4 here. I think this made sense to somehow simplify the position, and he's actually happy with the draw at this point, I think. So a4, clever move to add some more spice to the position. After rook b8, you can see that the other rook is coming to c8, and at the same time we are relying on this pin on the b file to avoid white's c4 move. Rook f3 was played in the game, rook fc8, pawn takes, rook a6, and here simply the move rook b6, trading off that rook so that it's not annoying for us. If they don't want to trade, well, we will play rook c6 and we will target the pawn on c3. I think actually that happened in the game. Anyway, I looked at this also, rook takes, knight takes, and bishop a3 to bring the bishop to c5. But even here you can see after knight e5, bishop c5, f4, this is a very good move because if white goes c4, we could take and then play knight e3. Interestingly, in this variation after c4, pawn takes, knight e3, rook takes, knight takes e4, still white will be a pawn up, but at this point you can see that black has really nothing to worry about. He can always try to swing back the knight to d5 with a perfect blockade. So in the game after rook b6, white played rook a7 and black simply played rook b6. Later on they took this pawn, I think, and the game was later drawn. So very nice concept by Pragananda. He's a fantastic attacking player, but here he showed his defensive skills also. He gave up a pawn in order to change a little the nature of the game. Knight e4, he gives up a pawn because there is something in the pawn structure which speaks in favor of this change on the board. After knight takes, pawn takes, bishop takes, queen takes, f5, and later on take and put the iron knight on d5. I think that was a very nice concept by Pragananda. All right, we will continue. I have another example on the same topic of giving away a pawn. In this example, we have Pichot with white and Cordova playing black. You can see that the black is very active. They have a worse pawn structure. This pawn is weak on e6, but they have a lot of activity. The pawn on f2 is hanging right now, and you can see that they would like to perhaps bring in the other rook. In the game, what Pichot tried to do here was to keep the material balance. He played the move knight f4. It seems like if he will succeed, because now he's blocking the rook, and if black takes, then white would rely on this move g3, right, to get back the sacrifice material. Unfortunately, there is a flaw with all this. The flaw is that actually black can sacrifice the exchange, not a positional sacrifice. You could say a tactical sacrifice, an attacking sacrifice. They actually played rook takes f4 here at this point. Okay, there is also queen takes, but then we can take on c4. Or we could take first, of course. We could take like that. Bishop takes, queen takes. But still, black would take on c4, and I think black is at least not worse, probably better. We can try to bring the knight to d4 at some point. Queen takes, I think, rook b8 and so on. But anyway, what happened in the game, this was even still better than what happened in the game. After knight f4, rook takes f4, g3. White is playing this in a very, you could say, materialistic fashion. Black took on h3, and after g takes f4, what do you think black played here? Yeah, that was an easy one, of course, knight e4. Knight f3 is coming up, and also bishop c6. Complete nightmare for poor white in this game. They resigned at this point. There is no way out, too many threats to handle. So in just, you could say, 3 moves, white's game went into a complete disaster. So why did this happen? Well, as I see it, it's about white trying to keep the material balance when it was not possible. It was better. In this case, we don't have a choice really, like Pragananda had. Here there is no choice. We have to give up something. And it's advisable to just give up a pawn. Nobody dies because the opponent lands a queen on f2, so we can just do something with our bishop. We could either play rook c1 or bishop a2. I think it's smarter to play bishop a2 because maybe for flexibility reasons we might be interested in putting a rook somewhere else than on c1. It's not clear it's the best destiny, so I would vote for bishop a2, but also rook c1 makes perfect sense. In the both cases, it's the same idea. We let them take on f2, they can now take with the rook, we can take back, or we should take back because there are some threats, and after queen takes f2 we go king h1. As you can see, nothing happened really because they took that pawn. Our king is very safe. We even have some tactic like bishop d1 coming up next, and at the same time, as you can see, the bishop on d7 is targeted and the pawn on e6 remains a weakness. So I don't think that there are any big problems here for white. Queen f7 is one possibility to just come back and try to defend everything. White could play something like queen d3, which would be the ideas behind queen d3. What do you think? Two ideas at least. One, to quickly bring in the rook, and two, actually to build a battery. And it's white who is starting to have some attacking possibilities on black's king side. So this was a very simple solution that white could have resorted to. Give up a pawn, but keep some activity, or keep quite a lot of activity. So bishop a2, that was a good opportunity for white. Very simple, but okay, the grandmaster did something else, which shows that this is not a simple topic. No, it's something which it's difficult for most of us to give up material like this. So bishop a2, we should try to remember this move. It's a perfectly possible move. We bring the bishop to safety, and we don't care about this pawn. They can have the pawn. They don't have enough, you could say, attack at this point to take this attack any further. Our king will be very safe on h1. So that was really a game changer, bishop a2. Let's check our next example. It's a more, you could say, a positional battle. It's from the Nimzo Indian. You can see that white's pawns on c3 and c4 are long-term weaknesses, as happens in some Nimzo lines, but the main problem for white here is that unfortunately their bishop, the Darshka bishop, is not in a good place. It's not supposed to be here, you know. It's supposed to be outside the pawn chain. And preferably e4 should have been in and the bishop should be on e3 or something like that. But yeah, something didn't go completely right in the opening here in this game between with white pieces Magro and playing black Bluebam. So at this point, what Magro did in the game, he played here rook fe1. Bluebam simply continued rook c7 to pile up against the pawn on c4. Another good option would have been to play first e4. This is a pattern that you can see also in some openings like the Sicilian Grand Prix, where white pushes e5 quickly to gain some more space, and later on they have like free hands to work on the weakness on c4. You will see why this is so important, this move. Anyway, back to the game. After rook e1, rook f1, rook c7, white played knight b3. And black found a nice move here. Instead of trading, they actually played this move, queen d7, because they know that trades are good. They will make the pawn even weaker, and they don't care about the doubled a pawns. Still, the nature of the game will be the same. After queen takes, knight takes, pawn takes, they still had a very nice advantage here. Oh, they didn't play like that. But you can see this is also painful for white. In the game, I think they retreated the knight, and knight d2. White played black played knight f6, and still this was difficult for white. The pawn is almost falling, and you can see that, it's going to be a weakness for the rest of the game. So this should be avoided. What white should have done here in this, you could say, example about positional defense, what they should have done, they should have given up a pawn, because in this particular position with the center being closed, these pieces are well placed, right? The knight and the bishop are very powerful, typical Nimzo arrangement for black. But imagine that the position opens a little. Imagine that there is suddenly something going on black's king side, for example. If that could happen, well, then those pieces won't be that well placed. So that explains why it's best move here. You got it. We should give up a pawn to free our game here, especially free the poor bishop on b2, which is not seeing daylight. So e4, that's the right move here. This loses a pawn, but it gains a lot of possibilities for white's pieces. Let's say black takes, e takes d4, and after c takes d4, if they take the pawn on e4, I think we can just take back and try to bring the bishop to f3, right? We take on e4, queen takes, and we play bishop f3. This means that we can later on put the bishop on on d5, where it will protect. Yeah, let's say black puts the queen somewhere, like queen g6. We could put the bishop on d5. It would be a fantastic bishop. Whenever they take on d4, we take back. And you can see that suddenly white's bishop pair has become very strong. You can imagine things like, let's say, rook c3, rook g3. If you remember the game, who was playing white in that game? Rachmanov, I think, with the white pieces. The game where he ran into some tactical surprise about prophylaxis, the last game I think that we had in the prophylaxis chapter. Yeah, so that's similar to that game, right? The bishop pair and the rook along the third rank. Something like this is a completely different situation. Look at black's pieces. I mean, they're still useful for attacking this pawn, but apart from that, they're far away from the action. Well, black would have preferred to have a knight on f6, for example, for defensive purposes. So, okay, let's say c takes d4. Let's say they take instead on d4. C takes d4. We could simply play rook e1. You can see there is a tactic here. If knight takes e4, we can take on e4 once queen takes. And what is the tactic? Aha, that's right. Bishop g4. We actually don't win anything this time because black can take on e1. But after rook takes, king h2, I have this theory, or it's my way of seeing things, that the queen gets better and better in this kind of endgame battle with queen versus two rooks. The more complex the position, the more messy, the more disorganized the position, the better for the queen. It just loves this total disorder. It would like to play queen d7, take the pawn, take here, something like that. The more controlled the position, the less activity, the better for the rooks, generally speaking, I would say. So here, white would have interesting chances still for counterplay. Yeah, the rook is also hanging, that's right. So let's say after rook f1, black plays something safer, something like queen e5. Now we could play bishop d3, we protect this pawn, and we get ready to play knight f3 next turn. Black can still keep the extra pawn here. They can play something like bishop e7, and after knight f3, they go queen f4. As you can see, the pawn on e4 is doomed. We won't be able to save it, but after knight takes d4, bishop takes e4, what would you play with white here? What do we know about the bishop pair? That's a very good point. We should try to keep it. We can play bishop f1. We keep the bishop pair, we protect this pawn, we keep that one protected also. And please look at the other bishop. That's just a fantastic bishop now that the position opened. Remember how that bishop looked in the initial position and compare, please. You can see that here white is a pawn down, but they have a lot of activity. It's something about the pawn structure that we talked about in the introduction. It compensates for this minus pawn. And in the practical aspect, it's also much nicer to play this. There are more pitfalls for black. They cannot just win the game by taking these double pawns. They have to put them into more effort here. We have some ideas like, for example, doubling the rook, or maybe we can bring the rook to g3, somehow conjure some attack on the king side. So this would be an interesting option for white. They should have played this move e4. I think it's a game changer. My theory about why they didn't play it is that it costs a pawn. If they had a pawn on f3, they would have played e4, something like that. But yeah, that happens to all of us. We are not good with this idea of giving up material. In this chapter, you can see that in at least half of the examples, I think, the player didn't give away the material, actually. So e4, that's a key idea to remember here. We give up that pawn. It gives us multiple advantages. Of course, you could say, but why then does black have to enter all this if this is so good for white? Why don't they play something else? Yeah, they could play something else also. They could play something like queen d7. And after we go back with the queen, they could again refrain from taking on d4. I understand that mindset perfectly. No, they don't want to make any favors to our bishop. But in that case, okay, in the very end, we can close the game. Like a typical Nimzo, we will play d5. Black is not worse here, but it's a completely different story than the game because they didn't manage to really break through on the queen side. They didn't open up the c file and so on. So we can later on, how do you play these positions? You play something like maybe rook here, you try to reroute the knight to f5 perhaps. The bishop will have to also be rerouted, or maybe you can go for some f4 push at some point depending on what black plays, but it's a perfectly normal position. It's strange to have the bishop on b2, but in a closed position like this, time is not that a big issue. So this would also be okay for white. What they should simply avoid is what happened in the game. Some position where black plays e4 and then they pile up against the weakness on c4. So e4, that's definitely a game changer here. No matter how black reacts, we can see that it helps the activity of white's pieces in this case. All right, I think we have arrived at the The last part of this chapter, I forgot to mention that I had a few endgames also prepared, because giving up material is extremely important in the endgame. We're talking about active defense, which very often includes the handover of material. So that's what we have in our two last examples. First, in this game between Justin Tan and Mehmed Yaro with the black pieces, you can see that black is having a more active endgame. They have more active pieces and a space advantage. Basically, white would like to push their pawns on the queen side, and black is perhaps trying to do something in the center. But apart from that, you can see that there are concrete concerns here for white, because the knight's about to take one of these pawns and the king is getting closer to the knight and so on. Unfortunately here, Tan played the most obvious move. He played knight e8 check. This was the right move to play g3. Sorry, I clicked on the wrong button here. In the game they played knight e8. Yeah, we will come back to that was a spoiler. Now you know the best idea here, but never mind. King d7, knight takes f6, king e6. That's how the game went. And here Tan had a bad moment because he went for a pawn endgame. That's always a very, very critical decision. Now, knight to g4, I think, was the last chance, but after knight a4, black is already taking over. We would actually have to play g3. That's what you will see is the main idea here, try to create the passed pawn on the h file. Last chance here for white. In the game after king e6, he played b4 instead, which tries to bring up a pawn endgame, which it does also. For king takes, pawn takes, actually white is a pawn up here, but Mehmed Yaro noticed something very interesting. This is not trivial. Yeah, there is a reason why it's a very, very strong player. Mehmed Yaro, a super grandmaster, can find these things quickly like he did. Many of us would consider to just go king e6 and try to pick up the pawn somehow, but in that case, what do you think white would play? Exactly, they would play g3 and try to set up a passed pawn on that side. And black would perhaps even be in risk of losing in this case, because it would be some kind of outside passed pawn. No, probably not losing, because they could play something like that and e4, and it would be a draw probably, because yeah, both kings would be tied up to the opponent's protected passed pawns. But there is a way to win this game. So what he did, since he knew that white wanted to play g4, he cannot stop it really, but he played this move instead. Very, very clever, because now, as you can see, if white plays g3, it's too late, because we can take it, and in the end we can protect the pawn with the king, right? And if they do something else after king f5, I guess black would enter with the king and start attacking these pawns. So Tan played f3, and now he went back with the king when g4 is not working anymore. So yeah, really high class, top class endgame understanding. So now, as you can see, the king will come here, and if c4, the king will go that way instead, and white's king is too far away. So something like that happened in the game. Very interesting example about avoiding the transition into pawn endgames. It can be very dangerous to do that. Here white should try to keep the knight on. But a much better option, and now we will look at the main line here, is to go for this plan from the very beginning. Give up a pawn in order to set up a passed pawn. That's a really basic idea in endgames, very important. I think time travel also took its toll here. G3, that's what we should play here. Speed up the creation of a passed pawn before black's king gets much closer. So let's have a look here. Pawn takes, and after pawn takes again, we can push quickly h4. I think king g2 was also okay, but it makes sense to run quickly with the pawn so as to tie up black's king. King d7, h5, the king gets closer, king e7. Now if we continue with h6, they get king f7, king g6 in. You can see that knight f5, king g6. Somehow white is a little stuck here, and black would start, I think, attacking these pawns. So it's better to actually change the move order. We start with knight f5 to see where black's king goes. Yeah, it has to go to f7, exactly. And now, after this, we don't commit the knight or the pawn anymore, so we use the other pieces. So we can start with b4 to safeguard that pawn. After knight e4, we go c4. Now the pawns won't drop off, and we can play next move, king g2, if we like. And I think even black should be a little careful here. You can see some scenarios if white is able to take on g3, and it's white who's winning, right? Because knight takes, king takes. I mean, if black enters the pawn endgame, I mean, in that case, white wins, because they set up a passed pawn on this side and they have another one on that side. So white has some chances here. I think black should just take the draw here by king e6. In this way, they basically force white to play knight e7. Maybe h6 would allow knight e5. Okay, then you can also take. But I think it's even simpler if you give the check first and then you just come back. You have like black tied up here. They can't really improve. So this would be draw most likely this position. That's how white could have saved this difficult endgame by active defense. Give up something in order to create activity in some way. In this case, by playing g3, white is able to set up a pass pawn on the h file. That's a complete game changer. They will be down material for a while, but this also restricts black and creates like new opportunities for white. And in the last example, when we talk about active defense in the endgame, very often it's about the rook, because the rook, there is such a big difference between an active rook and a passive rook in an endgame. It can be terrifying, this difference. So it's very often worth it to give up a pawn in order to activate our rook. This is a game with white pieces Harsha, and playing black is David Anton. So David Anton is having some difficulties here. You can see that white's already a pawn up. These are the bishops of the same color, which is much less likely of a draw than the opposite color bishops. And also you can see that black's pawns are fixed on the wrong color. Now they are on dark squares. So because they have the dark square bishop, this is not the right situation for them. They would have preferred the opposite, to have them light squares and so on. So not easy for black at all. You can see that perhaps the move that most of us would consider here is rook d3. This is like a typical move to play here. However, white could bring in the king, king f3 or king f2, and play king e2 next turn. Not so nice for black. The rook will have to go back. And many other moves, I think, are met in the same way. King f3, king e2, and white will try to trade off black's rook. And yeah, black couldn't really accept that, being a pawn down and having these weaknesses. So a tough case for black. What Anton noticed was that he can give up another pawn, a second pawn, in order to improve the range of his rook, or the prospects of his rook. So how do you think he gave up a pawn here with the black pieces? Yeah, that's a very good point. It's a middle game idea, actually, a4, some kind of minority attack. But here we're using it for very concrete reasons. We want them to take on a4, and then we will play this move, rook d3. Now the difference is that we can go to a3 with the rook. That's a fantastic place, a perfect place for the rook, where it will target several white pawns at the same time. So very nice concept. Yeah, white cannot really avoid this if they play something else here. Bishop takes e5, that leads to a pawn endgame, I think. Rook endgame. I was thinking about the previous example still. Rook d2, check, king g3, and we trade off, I think, here. Bishop takes, rook takes, and of course we take on a2, as you can see. Yeah, rook endgame is coming up here, and this is going to be a draw rather simply. If they play b4, we can trade off the pawns anyway, and whenever the pawns are traded, this will not be difficult to hold, because white's extra pawn is not ideal, and black is very active now. An active rook very often compensates for a minus pawn in the rook endgame. So in the game, Harsha played b takes a4. Yeah, by the way, you're asking, of course, if they just stick to the plan. Well, in that case, you can again see that this move helps the rook, because pawn takes, we would play here rook d3. And suddenly we have a threat coming up, so we win at tempo here. Rook b1, we could play here before white's king gets any closer. We could play here rook c3. Very clever, so that after king e2, we can go c4. This way we trade off more pieces, more pawns, not pieces. We want to trade off the pawns. The pieces we need them. The rook, we need to keep it on the board, but we trade off the pawns because if white goes b4, we have rook b3, and if they take, they will lose this pawn anyway. So in this case, you can see that white will take, and it will be basically the same idea again. We take, and we have very good chances for a draw thanks to our active rook and the fact that white's extra pawn is doubled, no? So, all right, let's see the game here. a4, white took on a4. We know the next move, of course, rook d3, bringing the rook to a3. White, they took the pawn. I thought they had played king f2 in the game, but okay, if they play that, we will play rook a3, and as you can see, we can take this pawn next turn. And if they play something like rook c2, you can see it's very passive for them, right? We can just take on a4, and king f3, perhaps we can go back with the rook, and it's not easy for them to progress here. Also, we have a passed pawn, so it's not to be forgotten about. So in the game after rook d3, they played bishop takes e5, black traded, bishop takes, rook takes, and they played here rook a3. It was also possible to take the pawn, but I like Anton's move. It keeps white's king away. I think if I'm correct here about the mathematics, black is 3 pawns down here. Yeah, but not for long, of course. So white can keep at least one of the pawns, but it's still not going to be easy for them to win. They played in the game rook c2. They can also run with the pawn, by the way. Maybe this would be more critical, but against Anton, definitely no chance of winning this. King g3, rook a3 check, and if king h4, it's making sense to just keep the rook here, avoiding any pitfalls like letting them go to the other side and let them bring the rook like that. I think that's dangerous. Yeah, rook f3, they will actually go a6. Sorry, this is how they play. and they play rook a5. So please don't do that. We need to keep our active rook like that. On the a file, that's the key area for the rook in the back of the passed pawn. So in the game after rook a3, they played rook c2. Now we take on a2, a4. They played rook e2. They are keeping their 2 extra pawns. Please notice 2 extra pawns. But black has plenty of activity here. Rook a3, of course, so that white's king cannot approach. White played h4. And you can play in different ways. You can just wait with the king, but I think his move was nicer because we don't need to worry about f5. So he just played rook a4 here. White played king h2. Yeah, not making too much sense. I was looking a little at king f1, trying to bring the king to help the pawn. But in that case, you can see that black could go back. And if king e1, they can actually turn their attention to the opposite flank, rook h3, take this pawn. Please notice that if a4, they would not take the pawn anymore, then rook a2 is strong. So they would just come back with the rook and take the pawn. So it's difficult for white to progress here in the game. Harsha played king h2, there was rook a5. Why do they play a move like that? Well, very simple. They understand white's intention, something with rook g2 and f5 perhaps. So in that case, it's nice to touch this pawn on e5. Rook f2 was played in the game, king g7, king g2, black just waited here, king h6, and actually white agreed a draw at this point. They didn't try to win this endgame. They could have, of course, continued to try, but it was very difficult to progress here with black's rook doing so many things at the same time. That's a perfect rook, you could say, in the rook endgame, and this compensated for the 2 minus pawns. So, yeah, very nice idea by Anton. a4, trying to bring in rook, d3, and he doesn't care about losing another pawn as long as he has activity for his rook. So that's about defensive sacrifices in different situations. If we do the quick recap, we can start here with the game Thibaut Sanal, where white should have traded, I was going to say, should have taken on e4. For me, it's like a trade, but okay, if we speak about the nominal value of the pieces, it's not. But in any case, rook takes e4, pawn takes, and then bring the queen to g4, and later on knight h3, knight f4, try to create counterplay on the opponent's king side, exploiting this very strong knight in this structure with a nice stronghold on f4. Very important to have this knight maneuver in the very end here, knight f4. And h5, please don't forget that, to freeze the pawn structure. We saw Cordova's example, slightly different, but the same idea. Rook takes e5 was an important idea, so that we would be able to later on develop quickly with knight e5, bishop g5, or knight e4 and bishop h6, sorry, that was the idea. And finally, bring the rook to the battle also to e1 or d1, depending on black's play. So it was important to eliminate this strong knight. We saw that Pichot, he noticed this plan, he took an f5 and he traded the queens, and he took the battle to the queen side where he was better. In this way, he avoided black's supposed attack on the king side. We saw Martirosyan's key move, rook e5. That's definitely something that you can use if you're playing the King's Indian, for example. Remember these patterns. There is another pattern with rook takes e3, for example, when you take a bishop on e3 in some lines. But here he did it in this way. He understood that the bishop on g7 was very important, and it's worth the exchange to keep that bishop on the board. We saw that Bologan did something similar. He played c4, trading off that bishop, the fianchetto bishop, with good reason, because in this way he was able to keep his central pawns, and he left the opponent with a slightly passive bishop, you could say. It was, of course, attacking the pawn on c4, but that pawn could be defended, and black was always weak on the dark squares in this case. So very nice move, c4, giving up the exchange. We saw Guseinov sacking the queen for rook and bishop, and later on creating some kind of fortress with the bishop on e6 and trading off the pawns on the queen side by means of a5, a4. We had a game where Pragananda gave away a pawn in order to reach this position, reminiscent of this famous game Reshevsky-Petrosyan, the same kind of thinking, some blockade on the light square, so white has a bad bishop and so on, which paid off in the end, and he managed to avoid an assault on the king side in this way. We saw the game between Pichot and Cordova, where Pichot should have kept that bishop. He shouldn't have worried so much about the pawn on f2. It was just a small problem compared to what happened in the game, where white tried to hang on to the material. We saw the game in the Nimzo between Magyar and Bluban, where e4 was a key move in order to give away that pawn, or at least offer that pawn, so as to free the position for the bishop pair and avoid getting grinded on the queen side due to the weakness on c4. We saw the two endgame examples first. Tan could have created a passed pawn by means of g3. He would be a pawn down, but plenty of activity thanks to that passed pawn. And we saw Anton giving up a pawn correctly in order to activate his rook, to make his rook a more important piece. And it turned out to be a fantastic piece on the a-file in the end, and it saved black a draw in this difficult endgame. All right, thanks, and see you in the next chapter.